And joining us now on the debate in New Haven, Connecticut, Robert Schiller, economist at Yale University. And joining us back here in studio, Richard Florida, director of the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto. Phil Soper, president and CEO of Royal LePage, and Jane Saber, professor of marketing at Ryerson University. It's good to have everybody here. And in Points Beyond, hello to you, Dr. Schiller in Connecticut. I want to start, and I'm going to describe this, Dr. Schiller, since you can't see it very well. Here's home ownership rates in Canada and the United States. Thanks, Michael. We'll bring up this graph here. And the red line is Canada. And as you can see, since about 1980, it has gone up and up and up. This chart stops at the year 2006. I think we can assume it levels off a bit, given the recession we've been going through for the last couple of years. But look what's happening in the United States. A higher degree of home ownership, going up and up and up from certainly the 1990s on. And then the line is significantly trending downward. Richard Florida, to you first. More than 2 years after the financial crisis began, what do you infer from those numbers?
Well, first of all, you have Professor Schiller here who predicted this 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. And I actually wrote a dissertation, believe this or not, in 1980 something or other, 84 at Columbia, on the housing finance mess back then. I think the U.S. system just got out of control. They were financing anything and chopping and slicing and dicing these things up and trading them like candy almost. And the people couldn't afford the houses. And, they didn't have any money in the houses anyway. So when the bottom, they were underwater, and with the refinancing thing in the U.S., which we don't have here in Canada, where you can just refinance your mortgage, people started walking away. I think in the U.S., the baseline report now from the Urban Land Institute, and I like those guys, they're careful. Like Jane, they look at demography and trends in the economy. They're predicting it could slip to about 60%. I actually found when I looked at metro areas, using some of Professor Schiller's data and other data, that really robust metro areas in the U.S. have about a 55% rate of home ownership, with 45% of people. So we're resetting that. I think in Canada, when I wanted to write about this in Canada, my research assistant said, you cannot criticize the Canadian dream. This is on a pedestal. So I actually think home ownership is more deeply ingrained in the Canadian psyche.
Well, these are all the things we're going to unpack.
And I think our finance system, certainly, when I got here and realized I couldn't refinance my fixed loan, my closed mortgage, I was like, what's going on? But I think our system of housing finance, that banks keep the mortgages, is much more robust here. And I certainly feel much more comfortable as a homeowner in Canada today than I did when I lived in Washington, D.C.
You used an expression, underwater, and just so everybody, I know we hear that all the time. Do you want to give it, this is your business. Do you want to tell us what underwater means?
Well, essentially you owe more money than the prevailing market rate of your home, which doesn't exist anywhere in Canada today, but exists in all too many urban centers in the United States. One thing Richard said in comparing home ownership rates across different geographies, I know in places like Los Angeles and New York City, home ownership rates are lower, and you do have a more vibrant economy and a lot of turnover. Homes are also very much more expensive.
Absolutely.
And it's a long way to the suburbs. So we've crept up. Your chart earlier showed home ownership rates climbing over time. Typically, there has been a gap between American and Canadian home ownership that has been attributed to things like mortgage interest deductibility, which of course
which they have and we do not.
Which exists in the United States, and so I think we probably are in for a flatter period, and we probably peaked in Canada.
Dr. Schiller, I guess it was about halfway through the 2000s where the United States almost got to 70% home ownership. And I wonder if we were looking at those numbers in Western Europe, for example, what would the percentages be over there?
Well, it varies by country. Notably, the extreme case is Switzerland, which has only about a third home ownership rate. I was looking at Switzerland particularly of interest because advocates of home ownership claim that it encourages good citizenship and feeling of belongingness to the country. But Switzerland has those, I think. It's a very successful country, and it's filled with urban renters, surprisingly. I think that these theories that home ownership is so important for a national good feeling is exaggerated.
Well, then beyond economics, Jane Saber, why do people want to own a home here?
Well, I think actually, if we look into the consumer psychology research, I think that home ownership represents a feeling of rootedness. It really impacts their need to belong. It makes people feel like they've made it, and perhaps it's even a status symbol in terms of you have a stable job, you have a stable career. I do think that that sort of Canadian dream or American dream, however, is in fact exaggerated. I think that people, particularly in the changing demographic, I think that people now don't need stuff such as houses to feel like they have high status and that they're contributing to society. So although I think perhaps a 1950s era prescription for life might have been to own your own home, I don't think that that's necessarily the case today, and particularly in the case of a changing idea of what a family is. The old provisions of a nuclear family just are not appropriate for today's society.
I want to pick up, Richard, on the issue of citizenship because, you know, Robert Schiller's quite right. The home ownership in Switzerland is very low, and the Swiss certainly don't feel like they're not good citizens by not owning homes. But we've always felt, I think, in Canada and the United States, that the mark of a good citizen was somebody who aspired to own their own home. Not the case?
Well, I think the research on this is mixed, and I tend to agree with Professor Schiller on this. I think some studies have shown homeowners to be slightly more engaged. The problem is, where there's high levels of engagement, a la Professor Robert Putnam's brilliant work on social capital, they tend to be older communities with older people, and the rate of home ownership in those communities tends to be 70 or 75 or 80%. But I think that the real issue is when you look at the research of this young woman at the Wharton School, who's found that homeowners are not necessarily happier. We've always thought that a homeowner was going to have a happy life with the kids in tow. They're not necessarily happier. In fact, compared to renters, they feel more stress. Well, according to this young woman's research, they spend more for their housing, they have more maintenance to do, they experience higher levels of stress as homeowners, and any of us who's been a homeowner know that a home can be difficult. I think the real issue, though, between Canada and the US, Canadians are far less mobile, and the labor market in Canada depends far less on labor mobility. Torontonians tend to be in Toronto, or if they go anywhere, they go north and south. Mm-hmm. In the United States, labor mobility and residential mobility tend to go hand in hand. And it's really put a crimp into this ability. And of course, jobs are created in certain areas, declining in others. Midwest is down, you know, other areas are up. And I think it's really put a crimp in the U.S. ability to adjust to this time of economic restructuring.
Well, let's go around the table here, just for the fun of it. You own or rent, Jane?
Rent.
You're a renter.
Happily.
You own in Toronto.
I own in Toronto.
But in the States,
I rent.
You rent.
And I would rent in the States.
Now, the guy who sells homes for a living does not rent. There's not a chance you're a renter.
I'm an owner.
You're an owner.
Happy owner.
And Professor Schiller, how about you?
I have two houses.
And you rent the
I have
both?
a summer home and a rent.
And you own both?
No, I own both, yeah.
You own both, okay.
That's more of a personal thing than an investment.
I understand. I just wanted to get sort of everybody's background on the table here. So what? Yeah, go ahead. Pick up on that.
One of the things, we did a study, a roll-page study in 2008 that looked at different demographic buying groups. And one of the things that would perhaps fly in the face of the propensity to avoid materialism related to homes, found that people are buying homes younger in Canada, and the largest increase came from single women. So they essentially what it showed was that people weren't waiting to get married before they bought homes. They weren't waiting until they found a man or a woman to get a home. They were just buying homes. And I think it feeds back into the cultural stigma that comes with home ownership, or positive influence that comes with home ownership. And I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon.
Dr. Schiller, again, I want to go back to you on that chart that we started the program off with, where it showed home ownership in the United States from the 1970s just up until, you know, the huge crash in 2008, up and up and up and up and up. And I wonder if you could tell us whether you believe the increase in home ownership in your country has been unambiguously good for the U.S. economy during that period of time.
Well, it's definitely not unambiguously good, because many of these people are losing their homes. We got out of control. It wasn't a good thing going so far with it. Now, I'm wondering, you know, the home ownership rate is slightly higher in Canada, even though the United States has made major efforts to subsidize home ownership. And it seems like we've made a mistake. We should have left it at a lower level. It may be demographic or urban-rural differences that account for part of the difference, but you know, I just don't, come back to this theme, I don't think it's so important for the American dream that people own houses. And I think maybe people are starting to recognize that. And renting, I predict, is going to become a more accepted consequence.
Yeah, Ed Phelps had this great quote, at Columbia. He said, the business of America used to be business, and somehow with all of these government programs, we turned the business of America into housing. And in economies, when I looked at the data, and Professor Schiller would have looked at data as well, places like Phoenix or Atlanta, these cities of sand, 30, 35, 40% of their entire economies were housing and residential real estate. I mean, that was bigger than government and education and manufacturing combined.
So it was built on a house of cards.
It was built on a house of cards. It was partly a way to create low-skilled employment through construction jobs, but it's got to give. And I think Jane's right, and others are right. When we talk to younger people, and when I look at some of the surveys of younger people, they don't want to get into this trap. They prefer to be renters. They know they have to be mobile. They don't define their life so much by material goods. So I think we are in this resetting process. Now, will we go to zero in home ownership? No. Will we get beneath 60? Maybe. So we're still going to be a nation of homeowners. But I think Professor Schiller's right. We got to get government sooner or later out of this business and let the market work.
Jane?
I've got two comments. The first is about why young single women are actually buying homes. Look, these young single women, if they can buy homes, they're career-oriented. Well, they're probably not getting married either. So what do? They get pressure from everybody. Get married, have kids, have the house, etc. They do what they can, which is to purchase the house. And then the issue about, so that's the first kind of feeling I have. The second issue that I want to bring to your attention is the fact that we all think that the Canadian market is in such better shape. I don't personally believe it is. And the reason I don't is we have a rate of at least 70% home ownership. Now, if you look at the 2006 census data, we have huge demographic shifts going on, and we also have some median income figures, which are frightening. Okay, so let me just, first of all, we have an aging population. Okay, the aging population is going to be dumping their houses. There's no question about it. These folks don't want to shovel the walks and mow the lawns and clean the 4,000 square foot house. They're going to be selling. They're perhaps going to be buying condominiums. They may be going to seniors' properties, or they may be simply going into apartments.
So too much housing stock on the market.
Too much housing with that.
But maybe good to be in the condo business then.
Might be. Number two, we have a really strong change in our distribution of single versus married versus size of family and so on and so forth. 1921, the average family size was 4.7 people. Today, it's 2.5 people. There's more people, more families without kids than there are with kids. The average number of kids that are at home is 1.1 kids versus 1.7 kids simply in 1971. More singles, more single parents. Singles living by themselves is 26.8% of Canadian society. Why do these people need homes? And then to top it all off, you have a median income of parents with children. Single parents with children, median income is approximately $30,000. Okay, median income with two parents, whatever they may be, median income is $67,000. Okay, average house prices in Toronto between $300,000 and $500,000. Okay, over 15 years, that works out to about $2,800 a month. At $30,000 a year, you only get in your pocket $2,500 a month.
Math doesn't add up.
Math doesn't add up.
Yeah.
Even if you're at the 67,000 median, you don't have enough. You've only got $1,200 left for food.
Lest we give people the impression that we are extreme, and I know that Phil doesn't want to do this, that we are very sour on this program on home ownership. Let's try this though. I mean, Robert Schiller, there are obviously advantages to owning your own home. This has been a cornerstone dream for people in North America for a very long time. We're still influenced by this. Do you want to make a bit of a checklist on what those things are?
Well, I think the main advantage is some kind of social status. People think that apartment buildings tend to be less successful people. They want to go into a real neighborhood. and they want their children to be going to school in that neighborhood and associating with other people who are successful. I think the children and the schools are a major part of the demand for housing. People are doing what they think they have to do to establish themselves as a good part of society. It's that model. We don't really have except maybe in places like Manhattan, where there's a model of having children in a city and renting an apartment. It just looks like a failure story. And people are, it's not so much patriotism, they just want to get ahead and established in our society.
Phil, in blue state Canada, in egalitarian Canada, is it still seen as a status thing to own your own home and you're somehow seen as better than somebody who rents?
Well, I think it comes down to the practical realities of home ownership versus renting and the accumulation of wealth. If you step back and you look at equity markets and home ownership, yes, equity markets do well, but you have to look at home ownership as a combination of consumption and investment. And the truth is, at retirement age, people who have owned homes, particularly, and the earlier they got into home ownership, just like the earlier they got into a 401k or an RSP, the more wealthy they are at the end of their lives. For a $30,000 a year earner, $115,000 at retirement, which is obviously not very much, compared to $5,000 for someone who's not a homeowner. It's forced savings, but at least it's savings that people can get some emotional commitment
I want to go to the economist on that one. Do you agree with what Phil has been saying here, that given the choice, you're actually better off in the housing market as opposed to the equities market?
See, this is an important thing about self-control, that people might actually buy a house as a self-control mechanism.
Absolutely. And I think Professor Schiller's research, I mean, I think he's a leading scholar in the world on this stuff by any margin, but two things he taught me. When he looked at this century of housing prices, he found about a 0 real rate of return. So it turns out to be not the best investment. And he said something, and I hope he will say it, something like, would you advise a financial advisor to put people that don't have a lot of means into this non-diversified, essentially put all your money into one basket of apples instead of diversifying it? And I think for many people it could be a way of forced savings and self-control, but for many others it's not the best way to use your money, and it's not been a great investment vehicle. I think the issue is, do you like it? Do you want to own your house? Do you feel like it's something? It's really a use value argument about how you feel, and I do it here because I like owning my house, but I know it's possibly and probably not the best investment I could make.
Jane?
Just in terms of some of the number crunching that's been done, there has been some suggestion that if you compare owning a house, which has an average in Canada of a 2.5% return on a long-term basis, versus the equity bonds, et cetera, markets, or other investments that you can make, the return after inflation is actually better over the long run not having a house.
It's better if you're in the stock market as opposed to...
It's better in the stock market, but I agree.
Even with 208.
Yeah, apparently so. There's different ways of calculating this. So, you could probably argue both ways. But on the other hand, the suggestion that owning your own home is the only way to financial prosperity when you retire probably is not, and you wouldn't even agree with that, but probably is not the only idea. And my parents sold me this bill, buy your home, buy your home. It's just not necessary. What do we get out of it? We get shelter. How much shelter do you need? Are you the 5-star shelter? If you want that, you can have that.
Well, hang on. I'm going to the economist to get on this. Let's get this clarified. If you buy a nice house in a nice neighborhood in New Haven, Connecticut, or if you put your money into the stock market, where were you likely over the last 10 years to have done better, Dr. Schiller?
Well, it depends exactly, well, in that last 10 years, what was that? That was 2000.
Depends. It states
I have to figure it
Canada.
out. You're taking too short an interval.
Okay, well, you put the time parameters on it. You put the time parameters on it.
It's a century.
Take a long time parameter. It's true the stock market has earned something like 7% real in the United States. Housing market more like 0. On the other hand, people leverage their housing investment by borrowing on a mortgage. They borrow 90% of the value of the house or more on a mortgage. So any slight appreciation in home values causes a multiplied effect to their home, their home equity. And people exaggerate that. I think it's a mistake. So I think Jane is right that if there's no other considerations, you want to hold a diversified portfolio with stocks and bonds and then rent. And then you're diversified and you're putting yourself into assets that have historically often done very well in contrast to housing.
And I want to add to that. I often think of investments, because my earliest studies were a venture capitalist. When a venture capitalist invests, they have one criteria in mind: exit. And so I think if you're in a career which requires you to be mobile, if you're a young person front-loading that career and thinking about, well, I might live in Toronto or London or New York, I have to go where the jobs are, and you think you have to move around a bit. And Canadians less so, but Americans in their careers have to move around. My dad had one job in a factory for his entire life. Americans are now switching jobs. Canadians less so quite a bit. So I think about exit, and I don't even worry that much about, am I going to take a little hit, right? When your stock market or your 401k goes down, that's bad, but it's not terrible. What terrifies me in the U.S. is these people who cannot sell their homes and cannot exit. So I think renting, there's a financial comparison, but if you're in a labor market where you may need to move, that question of exit, I believe, becomes paramount. And if we stick people in locations owning homes, Detroit would be a classic case, or Cleveland, or Las Vegas now, and they can't sell. They can't go to where they need to go to make money. So I think that's an additional factor, this ability to sell and exit. It works well in a boom time, but as soon as the bus comes, boy, oh boy, it really puts a crimp in your economy.
Phil?
So a couple of things. Firstly, it's 2.4% over the last 50 years that Canadian homes have appreciated, compound growth rate, and that's real. That's stripping out of inflation. So it's not the kind of returns that any of us would look to in a stock investment, but it's also consumption. You know, we're using the home, we're getting some utility out of it. Secondly, we have no contemporary equivalent to the Detroit situation. You know, we operate
in Canada.
Yeah, we operate brokerages in the United States, including in Detroit, and it is a very difficult situation. If I look back over the last 50 years, the closest we came was the 70s in Alberta, particularly in Calgary, where people did have negative equity situations and they walked away from homes. But even then, if you lowered your price, you could sell your home. In the late 1980s in Toronto, when we had the most difficult housing market in the last 30 years, much more difficult than the one we just went through, if you wanted to move your home, you just had to reduce your price. So we don't have situations like exist in Detroit or Las Vegas today.
Did I read right? I thought I read the New York Times recently that the average house price in Detroit these days is $75,000.
Less, I think.
$17,000.
Well,
$17,000 in the city of Detroit.
In the city.
Yeah, my friends, I have friends who live downtown. My wife's from the Detroit area. I have friends who live downtown in the development that was featured in the New York Times Magazine, the Lafayette Square Mews. It is amazing. If you go on that website and see what you can buy a condominium in there for. It is, now that's where the people who are making 30 grand a year, they can afford a very nice place there. Right. But and even with that, they can't move them.
That's shocking. Jane?
You know, everybody suggests that Canada is not in such a bad position as the U.S. And
because it's not.
I don't know if I agree with
don't
that.
agree.
I do not. Okay, going back to these statistics, look, 70% of our people own houses, and yet the median income is, let's say, for purposes of argument, $50,000. How are these people going to afford it? How are they affording it? That leaves them $1,000 for life. Okay, but then on top of that,
But apparently they are, though, aren't they?
yeah.
And affordability is nowhere near as dire as it was in 1989, when it took half of the average Canadian's disposable income to service their home, their principal interest. It's considerably lower than that everywhere except the lower mainland of British Columbia.
But we're painting ourselves here in Canada as having such wonderful bank legislation and such, well, only recently did the 30-year mortgage disappear and 0% down. That's only fairly recent.
Okay,
I mean, we
well,
had that.
Once again, I'm going to go to The Economist on this. You know, compare the Canadian situation with the American situation. We're just arrogant enough in this country about hockey and about our banks. So we think our banks are better. We think probably our real estate situation is more secure here than it is down south. What's your view, Dr. Schiller?
Maybe. I find it very hard to predict the real estate market. You know, Canadian home prices have gone up in real terms substantially. It looked like many cities in the U.S., not the most bubbly cities. And they continue to go up. The U.S. peaked in 2006, and Canadian cities, they had a little interruption in, 2008, 9, but they have, the question is this, it isn't all or nothing, but does it have a bubble element to it in that people are buying more housing than they would like to because they expect home prices to go up. And if that expectation falters, they could go down substantially, and someone with a high loan-to-value ratio mortgage could be wiped out. I think that is a possibility for Canada, but I'm not forecasting it. I don't feel that I know how these expectations might change in the future.
And let me follow up on the point Richard Florida just made, which was that, you know, if you're into home ownership and the economy goes south and you're stuck with a home you can't get rid of, you can't get rid of your house to move to where a job is. Is that a significant prevailing force in America today, do you think?
That's controversial. Narayana Kocherlakota in Minnesota has been arguing that it's a very important cause of the high unemployment today. I'm inclined to think that it's of some importance, but that the most important cause of the high unemployment in the United States is just a loss of confidence. It's not that kind of structural unemployment. But it is a factor, and it's absolutely right that having an ability to move around, we may develop more of a kind of a world urban culture in coming years. And I suspect that urban environments will become more attractive, and there could be a relative price change. After these people retire from their suburban homes and they try to sell them, it could be that young people want the kind of urban, lively lifestyle in an apartment, high-rise somewhere, and those homes might drop in value. I don't know, but I worry that that could happen.
Let's do Phil, then Richard.
Yeah, you're reading something that Richard wrote recently about employment mobility and its impact on the economy. I believe it really does have a big impact in the United States, where we have people in our U.S. operations moving all over America. In Canada, as you pointed out, Richard, we have much less mobility. And in fact, we're the second largest employee relocator in the world, our relocation services. And what we found is a decreasing reliance on employee mobility among major corporations in the U.S. Because of globalization, because of technology. People are traveling, they're getting in airplanes and going to work, but they're not moving. Dual income families are staying put, and in Canada that's even more so. There's actually less mobility than there used to be, and so it should have less impact on the economy.
And I think Professor Schiller's right about this trend, and Jane, this trend towards urban living. We see it in all of the data. You know, Jane Jacobs, who was a Torontonian, told us about this a long time ago, that cities are invention machines and they're productivity enhancing and personal leverage machines. They save you time. You don't have the long commute that's time wasting. They're very efficient, even now we're finding with regard to the environment. So cities are becoming more productive and more desired, and fewer of them. You know, as we go to this global urban culture, the United States has a lot of cities, medium, small, second tier. It seems like some of the big cities are doing very, very well, and then some of these college towns that offer a kind of urbanity. We know that people will pay a premium to live in a dense, walkable neighborhood. I think one of the issues we have right here in Canada is our urban centers are holding up reasonably well. We saw this in Washington, we see it in New York, but the sprawling areas have gotten quite out of touch, and I think they could see a big decline as demography changes, as household sizes shrink, as people put off getting married or have a divorce. So I think there is this shift in preference, and I think it's going to show up in a housing price differential. When I look at Professor Schiller's numbers, the housing price differentials, not only city to suburb, but across cities in the United States, are stark and shocking to me. You know, Detroit to New York would be the most self-evident example, but these differentials are becoming quite significant city to suburb and across regions, and some you may do well, and others you may just get killed.
Robert Schiller, what about this argument that I think all of our parents said to us once upon a time, which is you don't want to rent, you want to buy because you don't want to be throwing your money away. You don't want to be giving your money to somebody else and improving his equity or her equity. You want to be putting the money into your house and improving your own equity. What happened to that argument?
I think it's fallacious, because if you don't buy a house, you put it in the stock market or something else, and you were earning it. So it really is wrong, that argument. In fact, this calls to mind another thing, though. We were talking earlier about the Swiss and their low home ownership rate. I think that there's kind of a Swiss-Canada parallel. The Swiss, they're very proud of their financial culture, and they're very proud that they own stocks. They're smart investors. And they're similar to Canada in another way. They're both frontier societies in the sense that Canada has, Switzerland has the Alps, and Canada has all of these beautiful territories where we Americans go on vacation. But there's a sense of common ownership. Both Switzerland and Canada are more egalitarian societies, and there's a national feeling that we own this huge property in common, in some psychological sense. And we're smart investors, and we're not fixated on this little house and yard that we have. So I think that kind of culture could carry Canada to a lower level of home ownership, and still a very strong sense of national identity.
Okay, Jane, you're the renter here, so I'm going to follow up with you. Now, I don't know how much you're paying for rent, but you're a professor at Ryerson University, so you probably live in downtown, right? You live in the city?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to you're paying $2,000 a month at least in rent.
Something like that, yeah.
Okay, you're telling me that's more financially advantageous for you to put that money into the pocket of your landlord as opposed to spending it on your own home?
Absolutely. Crunching the numbers, I would get a similar condominium property with the same amenities, I'd be paying after taxes, utilities, et cetera, double. Now, what benefit do I get? $2,000 versus $4,000. Do I get any extra benefit from owning, except that when I bring my friends home, I say, I own this?
And you got something to sell at the end of the day.
I've got money in the bank instead. Well, some. I like shoes.
She likes shoes.
I've got lots of shoes.
All right, Phil.
Shoes are a worthy investment.
Shoes are good. Yeah.
Shoes are good.
Okay.
Shoes are good. I think the challenge is exactly that. When people aren't putting their money away in houses, they're not putting it into stocks and bonds. They're putting it into consumer durables, and they disappear. This year, this RSP season, 401k season, 1 in 4 Canadians will contribute. And the capacity that our system has to accept, it will be used 7%. So in other words, if everyone took advantage of what is just the minimum amount one should be putting away for their investment, 7% of that capacity will be used. 1 in 4 will invest. At least when they're investing in their home, they're getting some. It is an appreciating asset, 5%, including inflation over the long term in Canada.
I want to make a point about the U.S. and Canada. Now, having lived here for 3 years, and not only understanding Canada better, I think living in Canada, as the great Marty Lipset once said, if you want to understand America, you better go live in Canada. It's the control case. In the U.S. now, with all the turmoil, I wrote a piece for one of the major newspapers here about this. With all the turmoil in the economy and in the housing market, Professor Schiller's been engaged in these debates, Ed Glazer at Harvard, and all the people I know and respect. There is a conversation in the United States that's very robust about how we get government out or limit its role in the housing market. What do we do with those secondary mortgage market institutions? And how do we reset our housing market in the United States? It's a robust conversation. It's going on in Washington. Do we need this high rate of home ownership? In Canada, aside from you, Steve, we are not having this conversation. Everything is hunky-dory, the banks are stable, the Canadian dream is in full force. So I wonder, and I worry sometimes, if we're a little bit too complacent up here in Toronto and in Canada, where the U.S., with all the trouble it's having, a crisis may be a terrible thing to waste, but maybe it's not being as wasted as many people think. Action has not been taken, but there is a conversation that I could not have imagined occurring about the quote-unquote American dream occurring in the United States. And that conversation, save for you, is not happening here. And that has me a little worried.
Well, speaking of quote-unquote, I want to read a quote right now, because James Truslow Adams is the guy who apparently coined the expression, the American dream, in his 1931 book, The Epic of America. And here's a passage. A better, richer, and happier life for all our citizens of every rank, which is the greatest contribution we have made to the thought and welfare of the world. That dream or hope has been present from the start. Ever since we became an independent nation, each generation has seen an uprising of ordinary Americans to save the American dream from the forces which appear to be overwhelming it. Now, those words are 80 years old, but Robert Schiller, you could have said them today as well. The desire, the heartfelt desire, we hear it all the time. The Tea Partiers talk about it, to have home ownership, to make sure the next generation does better than the previous generation, the sense that the future is going to be better than the past. And home ownership is a huge chunk of that. You know, this author says it goes back to the founding of your country. Where would you put it? At what point does that home ownership become such a fundamental part of being American?
A lot of people who came to this country, and I assume Canada too, were escaping from Europe. And they were escaping religious persecution, and they were also resentful of the feudal, or the remnants of feudal society. They didn't like kings because, you know, as Thomas Paine said, they really aren't better than you. Don't believe it. You've been suckered into believing this. And so there's a feeling of citizens. You know, this was underlying the American Revolution, the French Revolution. And the idea is, I'm not under the thumb of any landlord or lord of any kind. And I think and Alexis de Tocqueville noticed this too. It became a symbol. It was largely the farm. People thought they would live on a home on a farm, and it was an ideal that they dreamed about, and they thought, it's going to be my farm, our family. There's a dream. I don't know if it's the American dream or what it is, but to me it connotes a more egalitarian society, and a society that we have a common feeling.
Jane, I think
so there's something to be said for home ownership in that sense. But
I think de Tocqueville also said it's okay to live under somebody else's thumb as long as you have enough money for shoes at the end of the day.
Perfect, absolutely
I thought that was
perfect.
part of the quote.
Yeah,
but
no,
I could be wrong.
absolutely, I'm sure of it. You know, I think that by and large, home ownership represents certainty and stability, okay? Now, and I think you pay for that financially and emotionally and in terms of maintenance, and you become a janitor and you become a maintenance man and you become a real estate speculator and you also become a highly leveraged investor, all these things when you own homes. But the problem is we're searching for certainty, but I don't think that owning a house is the way to achieve certainty. And if you need mobility, you lose your jobs, the U.S., from what I understand, is really having trouble with its economy. If the U.S. economy falls, ours falls, and I don't care what happens. Those folks who depend on manufacturing and exports for jobs, those folks aren't going to have the money to pay for these houses.
Got a couple minutes left here. I want to hear from everybody on this. What is the poor economy in the United States doing to the North American dream? Call it what you will.
Well, it's Professor Schiller said, it's just kicking them in the stomach. Confidence is being reduced, and without confidence, it's very difficult in business or for a nation to move forward productively.
Richard, Florida?
Home ownership's a big part of this story. When you were reading that Truslow Adams quote, the housing economy drove the American and Canadian economies. We were manufacturing economies. When my dad bought that house in 1960 with his factory worker's wage, he bought a TV, he bought a washer and dryer. He filled that up with industrial goods that were being produced in the U.S. and Canada and North America. Now those goods, North Arlington, New Jersey.
In Arlington,
North Arlington, New Jersey, a suburb, euphemistically speaking, of Newark. But now, all of the home ownership is not stoking the engine of a knowledge economy, of an idea-generating economy. If we're spending all this money building and selling houses, if the average American is, they were spending in 1950 or 40, 22% of income, household income on housing. Now some are spending 50, 60, 70, and many are spending 70 plus. Some are even spending 100 plus % of income on housing. So how are we going to build a knowledge economy? How are we going to build an idea-driven economy? How are we going to grow those new industries that are going to fuel us if we're building sticks and bricks? So we've got to change, not only because it's a good thing to do, because we need to figure out a way of housing that will help us grow, that we spend less money, use more efficiently, and help us grow this new kind of knowledge and idea-generating economy.
Robert Schiller, in our last 30 seconds here, having participated in this program, you're now going to go out and sell both your houses and start renting instead?
No. I think the American dream, the sense of unity in the United States is threatened, but I would say not so much by the housing market. We have something called the Tea Party movement. Nobody mentioned that we're going to see a change in government, probably. We're going to see the House fall to the Republicans and probably the Senate as well. But this is underlying a deeper sense of malaise in the United States that I'm worried about, and I hope we can get back our sense of coherence and of equality and citizenship that seems to be threatened right now.
And that's the last word tonight. Robert Schiller, the economist from Yale University, it's awfully good of you to join us on the line from New Haven, Connecticut. Thanks for accepting our invitation. Hope you'll come on again. And to our friends here in Toronto, Richard Florida from the Martin Prosperity Institute. Who's next, Michael? Okay, there's the two-shot. Phil Soper, President and CEO of Royal LePage. Jane Saber, the Professor of Marketing at Ryerson University. We're accepting contributions for Jane's shoe fund after the show tonight. Thanks to you two as well.